So we're still working this series through, and I said at the beginning that some of you will be disappointed in the series because it won't have been quite what you thought. Some of you are maybe hoping for charts that explain and navigate every aspect of what's happened in the last 2,000 years and what's happening right now in the context of where we're going, and then step by step. I will say that we're going to talk a little bit more about that kind of stuff next week. We're going to kind of get a little bit of that. And for some of you, you've been relieved, but maybe too relieved. And so we'll kind of hopefully, I'm saying this, we will hopefully disturb you a little bit. And so we want to see this as the ongoing reality of a journey. And so we also want to understand this is about how we read the Bible in lots of ways. I remember one of the kind of emerging trends out of how we read that kind of hit in the 60s, 70s, and then moving it a little more strength in the 1980s was moving away from phonetic reading of text or English text and more towards sight recognition. And so students weren't taught so much that the letter A sounded like a Canadian, or like somebody at the doctor. But it was, okay, here's the word the, and you just know it. You look at it, and that's the way you see it. I think one of the beauties of maybe a little bit more kind of educational understanding in the reading process is that we've now learned that, there's a combination of these two realities of reading things through phonetically and through sight recognition that helps readers ultimately read better. And so I think in the kind of history of the church, we have sometimes had these polarities of how we read the Bible that can be helpful, but also can, if we just focus in those areas, they can lead us into some distracted directions or problematic readings of the Bible. And one of the beauties, I think, that has emerged over the last, 20 centuries of reading the Bible is we're beginning to understand, I think, more and more how these different elements converge together and are part of how we read the text. And so my hope this morning is to help us with that, but then to step us into some of those apocalyptic texts this morning. And so I'm just going to pull up a screen because a lot of this is going to be on a shared screen. So when we think through this whole journey for us, I started with kind of my story, and that might seem really egocentric, and like, okay, why is he fixing on his journey? But I was trying to kind of connect it to, for us, we've all had part of a story in relation to this idea. Now, it might not have been by listening to radio preachers, as in my case. It might have been just simply what we've been taught at church, or what we've kind of started to piece together about how it's represented in the news, or all of those kinds of realities. Might have been through fiction we read, like the Left Behind series. But our story isn't really the whole story. It's a part of how we connect into the story, but it's not the whole story. And so last week, I tried to work us through the bigger story, the story that begins in Genesis, especially Genesis 1-3 and chapter 12, about how God created the cosmos. And it's even the word that is picked up in the New Testament in John, where it says, for God so loved the cosmos, right? Like, so that the loving act of creator God in Genesis 1-3, or Genesis 1-2, especially bringing the cosmos into being. But then chapter 3, where everything is disturbed by human rebellion and sin, and destruction begins to take place in the cosmos. And then we head to Revelation at the end, where God recreates, re-energizes, rebirths even the universe, if you look at Matthew chapter 19, verse 28. that everything is made new at that place. It's not discarded, it's just re-engaged. And so it's important, I think, if we're kind of looking at, let's say, end times or the last days, to realize that there is a story through the scriptures that helps us understand these realities. And so today, what I want to do is, oops, sorry, that's there. Today, what I want to do is take a look at what is now, what we might call the last days or the end times. And if you will, I'm kind of couching this in a set of three kind of realities. And so we have the what is now, which we'll talk about today, and then next week, what is to come, or what's kind of will emerge kind of in the scope of Scripture. What are the things that are to come, and then 2 weeks from now, what will be that kind of final reality of the end story. This is if you were reading a novel, which you should never do, and you skip a whole bunch and you look at the back and you find out what happened, who died, or how did this marriage resolve, or you look at the very end. And so we're going to peek a little bit at what the end is going to be. So today, what is now? Next week, what is to come? And then 3 weeks from now, what will be? And this is perfectly dovetailing into Easter Sunday at the beginning of April, where Tanya's going to talk to us through the whole series about resurrection as that recreation, the renewal, the regeneration of all things. It takes into, it's kind of perfectly stated by N.T. Wright in his book, Surprised by Hope, which Tanya's reading as well right now, where he says, God is going to do for the whole cosmos what he has done for Jesus at Easter, and that is resurrection and recreation. And so Tanya's going to wrap up, and she'll solve all the riddles of things that I've missed, I'm sure. And that'll happen on Easter Sunday. So that's kind of contextually where we have been and where we're going. But today, we're talking about what is now. And we'll get to in about 10 minutes, I want to talk about the whole idea of the last times or the end times. What about the time we live in now? And so as we head there, I think it's helpful just to kind of pause and look at how we read apocalyptic texts. Now, apocalyptic literally means revealing. And so when it says the Revelation as the final book of the scriptures, it means the revealing. And ultimately, as we talked about when we did this series on the Revelation, it's the revealing of Christ. It's the revealing of, it's kind of like standing on a mountaintop and being able to see things from the perspective of God, or at least somewhat of the perspective of God, and seeing more of the kind of end in the beginning, but ultimately seeing Christ at the center point there. Michael Gorman, in his book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, and I did talk about this in our Revelation series, but he has this really helpful little grid to help us understand different ways that people have approached those texts, how they've seen the whole kind of end times discussion and the things not only which are to come, but the things which will finally be. And this is kind of how we approach scripture in his understanding. Now, there are only two what are considered apocalyptic texts that have made it into what we call the canon of scripture, or the 66 books of the Bible. Now, there are portions of other books which have elements of the apocalyptic, and that's in like Ezekiel, parts of Micah and Zechariah and Isaiah, of course. Maybe of those other prophets, probably Ezekiel being the most. And then there are also all kinds, like hundreds of extra biblical apocalyptic books. Like this was a kinder style of text that was that was used all the time in the time and era of its writing. And so some of those have even been included in a larger canon that Catholics would read. And so, for instance, like the Book of Enoch is a largely apocalyptic text. But for us in the scriptures, we have Daniel in the Old Testament and Revelation in the New Testament. And they have astounding kind of similarities and correspondences, right? You have kingdoms of beasts in Daniel, and you have the dragon, that kind of beast-like empire of Babylon at the end. So they kind of share some similarities that way. It is interesting that the book of Daniel is written right near the end of the kind of story of the Old Testament, while the people of God are in exile. They're in Babylon. They're isolated from the holy city, Jerusalem. And Daniel, especially, and his friends at the beginning of the book of Daniel, are learning to live in a city of exile. And then you have this kind of correlation of their narrative at the beginning of living in exile, and then the kind of almost prophetic, or what we would call apocalyptic sense in the last half of Daniel about what this what life is like living under the boot of the empire. In Revelation, it's very similar, only it's not Israel as the people of God in exile. It's the church that's in exile, that's under the authority of a foreign empire, of a worldly empire. In this case, it's Rome. Just like in Daniel, you have the opening narrative of Daniel and his friends, the people of God in exile. In the Revelation, you have the people of God, the church, in exile, and Jesus, who is voicing his his understanding, his encouragement, and even his struggle with the church. And so you have that kind of correlation or representation. But in these texts, this is from Gorman, and he says there are, so I'm pointing, but you can't see where I'm pointing. You have two different kind of axes. On the x-axis, you have at one end, and this is how a lot of people approach the scriptures in relation to apocalyptic, and that is the text is code. And so the strategy is you have to decode the kind of prophetic apocalyptic elements in the scriptures, or decipher them. And so the idea is you have to kind of discover those precise connections. So if it's talking about locusts swarming, then you have to decipher what are the locusts, what is the context into which historically they fit, and what is the Bible saying in a kind of analogy, what is it saying about that those locusts are? And so people who think this way about the scriptures is it's very literalistic. And I don't say literal, and I think it's an important distinction. Literal means we read things for how they are as literary text, as literature. And so you read poetry and song different than you read narrative, different than you read a letter, different than you read something that's teaching, didactic, like a parable that Jesus used, and different than you read apocalyptic. You read an apocalyptic text different than you read the other. And so if we're treating it literalistically, then we think, okay, people in this mind have to think through, okay, either on the other scale, either past or future, who are the locusts? Like, what is the direct correlation? It's very literalistic. On the other kind of end of the spectrum, you have the text or the prophetic text or the apocalyptic text as a lens. And so the strategy is, in that kind of context, isn't deciphering and decoding exactly what those things mean and say. It's thinking analogically, like this is an analogy. This has a deep metaphor and symbolism that and perhaps it's a repetition of symbols used over time. And so if you're reading from this way, you're trying to just read like to get similarities. You're trying to understand, well, how is this imagery and symbolism used throughout the Bible, and what kind of meaning is realized through that? Now, that's one thing to say that, but we also think this through past to future, right? So something can be deeply based as far as the past and still be decoding and deciphering that all these things happened already, or somebody could say, no, these are all things that are going to happen, right? That kind of typical prophetic kind of understanding. And now we have to decode, okay, who is the Antichrist and what does 666 mean, and those kinds of things. And so I want to just take a look at 5 kind of approaches using this grid, how we read apocalyptically. And so right through the history of the church, there have been a small group of people who have read it prophetically, that all of the events, especially in Daniel and bits of Ezekiel, in Jesus' words in Matthew 24, Mark 13, it's the same kind of context, and also in Luke. And then, First and Second Thessalonians parts there, and then Revelation, that these are all about events in the future. And for the author, this was in the future of the original audience. And so, for instance, John is writing in AD 96, likely. And so what he's thinking through is everything that is going to unfold from AD 96 until the final reality of eternity. And in this view, someone could be thinking that when John is writing of this thing at this time, for instance, the locusts, these are Apache helicopters that were developed in, I don't even know where they were developed, whether the United States or the Soviet Union. That's what the locust is referred to. And so the reader has to decode all those future prophetic elements. And sometimes the reader can't do it. And so there are like self-appointed experts who will point us to all of those prophetic elements. And I don't think it's ironic that have made a lot of money off of doing that, or their entire ministries have been built around that reality. Another view is the preterist or preterist. That's just a fancy word for events that are in the past. So the suggestion here is that this is all things in the book of Revelation, that these are things that happened before it was written. And so when it talks about the fall of Jerusalem, this is about, well, even Jesus' words, this is about what's actually happened historically in their context. And so the task of the reader in that way is, I've got to figure out what do all these things mean, looking back at the past historical reality. If you take a look at, these are kind of 2 of the more predominant views at this time. There was always a prophetic element throughout church history, but it's really in the last 70 or 80 years where especially one aspect of that prophetic really has kind of risen to kind of mainstream evangelical thought. There are 3 other views, and I think these are kind of maybe better lenses, I will say, but this is more focusing on the lens kind of approach. The prophetic and the preterist are more focused on like the code, the Bible as a code, and we have to understand it that way. The poetic or theopoetic is a lens through which the reader at any time in the year 2021, in the year 542, is to look at their present reality in a new way. And so John was given an apocalypse, a revealing of reality in his time. And we, when we're reading the Revelation in the forces that exist, we see those same realities in a spiritual kind of context happening in our times and will continue to happen in the future. Sometimes this is called an idealist or a spiritual view. Guys like Origen or Augustine, who you've heard of, or Eugene Peterson, who translated the Message, would find themselves in this position. In fact, Eugene Peterson said the book of Revelation, I probably mentioned this because a lot of us bought that book and read it when we were doing the series on Revelation. He calls the book of Revelation a theological poem that does not call for deciphering, but instead evokes wonder. That as we read the book of Revelation and we see the evil empires around us, we see the symbolism of the dragon and of the beast, and we're called to a greater wonder at the ultimate power and authority and future of hope with God. There's also what's called the theopolitical or the political. And so they would see Revelation or the apocalyptic as emerging from a time of suffering and persecution as a form of political protest and dissent from the powers that be. So in ancient contexts, the power of an authority of Rome, especially having its boot on Christians and persecuting believers. This view gives the idea of the readers a view of the kingdom of God as opposed to the kingdoms of this world. Then you have finally, sorry, I'm just getting a little bogged down in here, the pastoral prophetic. This is the idea that that John especially is writing his book as a pastoral letter of encouragement to Christians. And so it sees this book as coming from the past and speaking to every generation of readers through our present and into the future. And the imagery gives us a sense of seeing the world in a new way. And it's the call of the church to remain faithful in the middle of all of that. And so the concern here is how we are being formed as Christians, formed and shaped. It's really why Revelation says at the beginning that this book is for our encouragement and strength as believers. And so where do these views fit on this grid that we've given? Well, the predictive is decidedly seeing those texts as future related, and it's about deciphering them as code. And we just got to figure it out, or we get guides who will help us figure them out. The preterist view sees them as all in the past, or almost entirely in the past, except for Revelation 20 and 21. They're past, and we just got to figure out where they fit there. The other views, which I'm going to suggest that we need to have a view that has some awareness of each of these realities, that there is an element where things were fulfilled in the past, and there is an element ultimately of God's prophetic future, but that we can understand these images from a poetic point of view, from a political point of view, like Martin Luther King when he's writing his letters to from the Birmingham jail, or a theologian kind of working through the whole issue of apartheid. We can see them as those kind of theopolitical texts, or we can see them from the idea of the pastoral prophetic, that this is written all the way through history. So what does this look like with a certain text, for instance? And then we'll start breaking some things down. So what about how we read Revelation 12 and 13, where it talks about the dragon who has 7 heads, and it refers to the 7 kingdoms and 7 hills. If you want a really interesting kind of discussion of this, I will push out the link for the Bible Project podcast. They do an 8-part series. They're about an hour long each, talking about prophetic and really kind of working through the integration of the poetic, political, pastoral kind of elements of apocalyptic texts. So at the first, in this kind of context, the prophetic would see, the ultimate new city, a new Babylon that's yet to be built. And then they have to identify, where is that new Babylon? What does it represent conceptually? And this is the place from which a world empire will be ruled, and the beast will rule over that. And so they're trying to navigate, when does this emerge in history? What will it look like? And then they're waiting for its unfolding fulfillment. And the decoders, or the specialists who are decoders in this place, they're reading the newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other, and they're just trying to say, oh, okay, well, this character meant that, and so then when coronavirus hits, right, you get these people go, okay, there's an increase in the plagues at the end times, and so they're trying to identify, oh, this is part of the plague. This is the kind of diet a lot of us have seen and referenced and consumed, I think, when we think through apocalyptic texts. It creates a problem sometimes for us, because there's clearly people who are experts, and we need to kind of, hear from them. And I think for me anyways, as I kind of worked through that in my journey, there was a lot of pride that went with that. Like, oh, okay, I can figure this out. And I get this insider understanding or insider secret knowledge, and then I can share it. And there's a certain kind of a desire to have those kind of profound understandings. And that could be problematic. The preterist view will see in the seven heads and the seven kingdoms and seven hills, the geography of the city of Rome and the Palatine Hills, and we'll reference this is Rome and its domination ultimately over Jerusalem, but the Jewish people are the people of God. And so they would see that in the past, this is the reference to the dragon there. The poetic or theopoetic, would talk about the imagery of the dragon. And even in the scriptures, moving out of chaos, the dragon representing chaos, and then even connecting back, all the way through the Old Testament, the kind of imagery of the dragon being that which is tied into the beast or the empire, and ultimately back to Genesis 3 with the snake, the dragon-like snake, who courts humanity and draws humanity away from God. And so they would see that as the constant presence of the dragon beast-like reality that's drawing people away from humanity, or away from God, sorry. The political or theopolitical would say those images are political images. And this is an idea of a spiritual rebellion at work in and through human empires and power structures. And so when the dragon is unfurled, or when the horror of Babylon comes, this is all the power structures of the day in which we live. And so Christians for centuries have seen in empire and in those power structures that kind of political thrust. And so when they look at Revelation and the dragon, they're always able to see the force of greed and empire against the people of God. And then the pastoral prophetic would say the image of the dragon and the seven kingdoms are anchored in Roman powers. And so for the immediate audience, the people John is writing to in Asia, Ephesus and Thyatira and Pergamum, those groups of Christians, but those areas of geography, it has that immediate sense of Rome's power. But by calling it a dragon, rather than saying, hey, Rome is at place here, like you have this evil empire against you, and it's called Rome, and it's Caesar, who you're being dominated by. by calling it a dragon, it frees it from its Roman context and being limited to that. And now it speaks of any human power or institution that acts like a beast for any generation, including ours. And so those are the different ways people have read it. Now, I think I mentioned that the danger is where we read only one directionally. There are elements of the prophetic that emerge in the context of Luke and Mark 13, where Jesus is speaking, by Paul in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, in Revelation, in Daniel. There are elements of that lead us forward to something. But if we take the whole text and read it only as a prophetic text, we're not reading it the way any apocalyptic text was ever read, first of all, and we're putting a meaning into it that is, I think, is at a minimum is a distraction from a bigger thing that God is about, but at the most, it's completely false. And you know, there are a lot of times in church history where people who have been the decoders, especially of the prophetic, but at times the preterist, but especially prophetic, where they've been decoding it and they suggested certain things that they see emerging, and then they've been caught by unfolding history as those clearly not being the case. And so that creates some danger. I think if Revelation is to be a text that leads us toward hope, ultimately, it's going to be thinking through the poetic, political, pastoral realities of the text, keeping in mind that we're in a story and it's going somewhere, but John is concerned about presenting us certain symbols and images that tie deeply into the Hebrew scriptures, that face the political reality of the world they live in, and are prophetically encouraging for them. It's why Martin Luther King, in the middle of that struggle, is able to pull into the text of Revelation as he's in prison writing about his specific context. So where does this leave us as far as where we are now? Well, there's one kind of phrase or a couple phrases that have worked to this is what we're at now. Oh, sorry, I meant to say this. I kind of mentioned this, reading apocalyptic. The two terms that we often hear is, are we in the end times, or is this the last days? Are these the last days? And so I want to take a look at those just quickly biblically, and then we're going to break out into groups to talk about what kind of feelings we have towards those, or what images. And so I'm just going to read some texts, and probably be too fast for you to follow through, but they'll be here and they'll be posted on YouTube. This is Isaiah chapter 46. He says, I will make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. The end from the beginning and what is still to come, kind of in that journey. Now, it doesn't say end times like verbatim that way. In fact, if you want to find end times, like end times directly, you're going to find them in subsection headings, which are not the scriptures. But you're going to have struggle to find them in a dependable translation as actually saying the end times. Now, it does say the last days a number of times, and I just want to read you some of those. This is Isaiah chapter 2, and this is repeated almost verbatim in Micah 4, so I'll only read it once. But it says in verse 2, this is what Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall stream to it. So if you're reading that from a prophetic text, you're saying, oh, this is the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of all. This is the renewal or resurgence of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and that will be established over all the mounts of, or all the places of worship. And this is the renewal of the Jews into Jerusalem and to the temple. If you're reading it from the poetic, political, prophetic, this is the last days is about God ultimately exalting all worship of himself, and nations will stream to God himself. So it's not saying the literal mountain and the literal temple, but it's seeing it as the spiritual reality of the community of God coming and people streaming to worship him. Hosea chapter 3, verse 4 and 5. For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days. Some of the New Testament references, 2 Timothy 3, verse 3, but mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, disobedient to parents, ungrateful. So the question is, for this text, is in the last days, is the scope of the ungratefulness getting worse as humanity goes on? And so they were really grateful when the church happened, but then in the Middle Ages, their gratefulness started to decrease, and ultimately in the last days, they're pretty ungrateful. I think you have to struggle to read that. But Hebrews 1 and Acts 1, verse 7, and 2 Peter will tell us we are in the last days, but they're writing in AD 54 or AD 62. And so the last days is something quite different there. So Hebrews 1, God has spoken to us through our ancestors, prophets, many times, various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So the last days is when God spoke to us through his Son, Jesus. Acts 1 says the same thing. Peter is saying, in the last days, there will be dreams and visions. And he's saying, and now, this is quoting from Joel, and now we're here. The Pentecost was the last days. And so this brings the kind of the tension that we've kind of started to work into, is that we live in regard to our hope as we're in the already, that thy kingdom come, thy will be done, but we're also pushing to an eternity where it says your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so the last days biblically, at the end times, is that which begins at the first advent of Christ, and the space in between that coming of Christ and the final advent, the second coming of Christ, which he will come to judge all things and to wrap eternity into this reality. That's the end times. It's like, so far it's like just under 2,000 years. Early Christians who were writing the New Testament said it was the last days, the end times, then when they were writing. And a lot of things have happened historically in those last 2,000 years. And Christians at different places have understood these texts to be their reality, that they are living in the end times. In the plague that decimated millions of people, up to 200 million people in Europe, that was the end times. I think through the context of our scope, where we talk about wars and rumors of wars and all those things, well, if you were to land in 1918, where how many died? 17 million people died in World War I, and it was throughout Europe, and that's a much, much smaller world population than now. You had just come from smallpox in North America, which smallpox had killed millions through history, but in North America, when the white people landed here, it decimated 90 to 95% of people. And then you have the Spanish flu, which hits about 50 million people in 1918. I'm sure they were looking around and going like, seeing every context of this apocalypse that was descending on them, and deeply aware of the pain all the way around them. And so the end times is the space between the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ. And we're kind of in this middle, this end, this, and it's odd that it's called the end. And yet it's not the end because it's been going on for so long. And I think that part of that is it's, if it's called the end or the last, it's navigating us forward in direction. We're looking to something that will finally end, where your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so Christians in all kinds of disciplines and churches have had this little kind of liturgy, and I think we lose that some, but where they would say in the Eastern Orthodox Church, every single Sunday, they would say, Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. You know, Christ has died, you know, first coming, first advent. Christ is risen, the middle reality, the unfolding of the God's resurrection. And then Christ will come again, that final renewal and resurrection. In all other kind of Christian denominations who have liturgies, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, some Orthodox churches, they simply say, Christ has come, Christ will come again. And I think there's some value to the pause between, because the space between the middle ground is the end times. This is where we are. And so we go to these apocalyptic texts for a deeper awareness of the reality. This is the revelation of something much bigger at play, where we can see God's unfolding action through history. So God calls us to that space. You know what? We will begin next week with a little bit of a talk back. I think we're a bit over time to kind of break out into groups. But here's what I would like to do as a group. And I know we can't do it by everybody turning on the mics and we all hear you. Sorry. But I want us to enter into that liturgy. And so it's two simple phrases. Christ has come, and then we'll pause. Christ will come again. Christ has come, Christ will come again. And so I'm going to ask us to say the first one together, and then I'm going to pause. Don't close your eyes, because then I'm going to point, and then we'll say the second one all as a group as well. And we'll pause for about 10 or 15 seconds. And I want you, in the pause between Christ has come and Christ will come again, to feel something of the reality of this journey through the end times over the last 2,000 years. I might go a little bit longer than that, maybe about 20 seconds. So Christ has come, Christ will come again. Okay, so together, let's say that. 3, 2, 1. Christ has come. And now the church says, Christ will come again. And as Christians have said, even so, Lord Jesus, come. Amen.